In this lecture, I'm going to take you through globalization and its impact on education. The lecture is broken down into three parts. The first part, we will look at the features of globalization, what we actually mean by globalization. In the second part, we'll then apply that to education and see how these developments, changes have impacted the education system in the UK, both positively and negatively. And finally, we will look at the perspectives, views on how education has been affected by globalization. I'll then take you through a 10 marker with item, so you can see how this would translate into that sort of question. At the end of this lecture, it's suggested that you go to your independent study booklet, and you complete this section of that booklet, which is in part 1, section E. So for that, you would need to check your notes against the knowledge grid questions to make sure that your notes are complete. There is the knowledge check, the 10 quick question knowledge check, followed by a consolidation and exam style questions. Okay, so let's get started then. So first of all, we need to look at what we mean by globalization. So globalization, the definition of globalization is the process of increasing interconnectedness between people and nation states. It's the world becoming smaller, if you like. And it has been an ongoing process for many, many years, centuries in fact. But we've seen a kind of explosion in globalization in the last 20-25 years. And there are 5 main features to globalization, 5 developments and changes that have occurred that have allowed for this greater interconnectedness and this smaller world that we now live in. The first, and probably one of the more prominent types, is the technological developments that we are seeing. Things like the new technologies such as the internet, which has created what is considered a time-space compression. Now, the internet is a relatively new invention. It's less than 25 years old, and in terms of its commercial use, and even in that 25 years, it has developed massively, from hardline connections, where if you were using your internet at home, you couldn't use your phone line, to Wi-Fi, to smart devices, 4G and soon to be 5G, data accessibility, smartwatches. All of these things have exploded in the last 20-25 years, which has created this smaller world, this time-space compression. Whereas pre-internet times, it could take a week for a letter to get from one side of the world to the other. It's now instantaneous. Whereas before, calling somebody, telephoning somebody who is in another country could be really expensive. Now we have FaceTime, we have video chat, and even in more recent times, we've seen this kind of developing further with multiple video chats, simultaneous video chats such as Zoom and Teams and things like that. But these developments, these technological developments, have made it easier for people to connect, to share information, to share cultures, to share ideas. Next, we have the economic changes that have occurred due to globalization. So economic activity now takes place on a global scale in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week system. Whereas previously you would have to do your banking during banking hours, 9 to 5 during the day. And if you put money into your account after a certain point of the day, usually about 3 p.m, it wouldn't be processed until the next day. Now, you can transfer money 24/7. You can move money between accounts, you can send people money if you wish electronically, and you can do it at 2, 3 in the morning if you really wanted to, because there's nothing stopping you. You are in control of that through linking back to technological developments through the internet. Shopping no longer takes place during business hours, and you can be online shopping at any point of the day or night. Usually middle of the night purchases can be a little bit dodgy or suspect, but you can do that, and that money is instantaneously taken from your account. You don't have to think 3 days down the line, oh, have they taken money for that purchase? If your money is not in your account, you can't buy it. But also we've seen this growth of transnational companies and an electronic economy. So companies like Amazon, which are transnational, they have headquarters in multiple nations around the world. They employ hundreds of thousands of people, but they operate in an electronic economy. They are able to see what is happening in each of these countries in which they work instantaneously. They don't have to wait for somebody to wake up the next morning to give them that information. It's available to them. You also have the growth of international banking, with people having accounts in different countries around the world. I'm talking in some cases things like Cayman Island bank accounts, where you need hundreds of thousands of pounds to open up a bank account in those countries, and they're extremely secure, and they're also tax havens. But also you can have companies registered in countries in which they do not operate in order to benefit from tax breaks. For example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the MP, his company is registered in Guernsey, which is a tax haven, meaning he doesn't pay corporation tax here in the UK. So these economic changes are linked to those those technological developments. These changes are not standalone, they are massively interlinked. And that leads us on to political changes. And this idea, which is put forward by, let me see, where's my pen gone? Yeah, O'May, who talks about this idea of a borderless world. Globalization and this growing interconnectedness has undermined the power of the nation state. People don't necessarily see the power of their government, because the government is linked to the global and the international community. Governments need to think about how policies will play on an international stage. They have to think about their relationships with other countries and how that could impact and influence various areas of their own nation. But in some cases, we can also see how transnational corporations have more power than governments. Again, we can use the example of Amazon, who in the UK, they haven't paid their corporation tax in I don't know how long, but the government is not going to come after them for it, for those billions of pounds that they owe, because they know full well that Amazon could easily take their company out of the UK, causing a huge spike in unemployment, and the knock-on effect would be catastrophic. So these political changes, this now borderless world in which we live, means that the national governments, could be considered to be losing power to more transnational corporations, but it could also be seen as linking into our next feature, which is cultural changes and cultural developments. This borderless world in which we now live means that cultures are able to be shared, they're able to be experienced in different parts of the world to where they originated. You just have to look at foods that are available now. When it comes to having takeout in the evenings, you have a world of options. You can have Chinese, you can have Japanese, you can have fusion food, pizza, Italian, Thai, whatever's available in your area. But you can also see that in terms of the films and the music that we are experiencing and exposed to. There's more access to foreign language films through programs like or processes like Amazon Prime, through Netflix, through other streaming services. You don't have to go to an art house cinema to watch a foreign film. You can do it from the comfort of your own home. Fashion has been influenced by multiple different cultures, and there is a fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation, but this bleeding of cultures, this hybridization of cultures has created this sense of a smaller world. And it's argued by some that this has also led to the development of a global culture, the sharing of certain features of our cultures across the world. For example, McDonald's have a branch in pretty much every country in the world now. You can go anywhere in the world and find a McDonald's, should you so wish. And this is linked to our final feature of globalization, and that's migration. Migration has increased massively over the last 10-15 years, and we're not talking here about asylum seekers or refugees, which are a slightly different issue. What we're talking about here is economic migrants, emigrants and immigrants who are moving to different parts of the world for economic reasons, for social security reasons, for a better life, and technological developments such as aeroplanes make that much easier now. Transporting your worldly goods from one place to another isn't as difficult as it was 30-40 years ago. And this migration has helped push the cultural developments and push this global type culture that we're seeing developing. So when we're talking about globalization, we are talking about how the world is becoming more integrated, more interconnected, with a time-space compression where things are now more instantaneous than they were previously if you're working on a global or international level. And what we want to look at next is how those features, how those changes and developments have impacted and influenced education in the UK. So, moving on to our second part of the lecture, when we talk about globalisation and education, it has had a variable impact. Some would argue that the impact is good. Some would argue that perhaps the impact isn't as good. One of the first ways that we've seen the impact of globalisation on education is the increased competition for jobs. The global job market has become highly competitive, with all companies now realising that they don't have to limit themselves to the pool of candidates that are in their local area. They can cast a wider net, because technological developments and migration means you can really get the best person for the job rather than the best person in your area. And that has impacted schools, because it means that schools have had to change curriculum, they've had to change the skills that they're trying to develop in their students in order to ensure that they can compete on an international level. For example, the development and the introduction of computer science into the curriculum. This is a newish subject. It wasn't one that I was taught when I was at school in the 90s. To be fair, the internet wasn't really that prominent and computing wasn't that big of a deal at the time, but now it is overtaken information technology as a subject, because people need coders, and if we want to compete on an international level, we need to include coding as an opportunity within our curriculum. Next, we're seeing a lot more of the global computing companies such as Apple and Google creating content for education. They're creating resources and curriculums, and they're pushing that, not necessarily, I wouldn't say pushing their way into the education system, but they are becoming more active within the education system. For example, schools now tend to either be a Google school, where they use Google Classroom and Google online services to support their curriculum. They could be a Microsoft school or 365 school, where they use Teams or OneDrive as part of their resource development. Or you've got Apple schools as well, where they use the iOS as their main format. But it's the moving of curriculum online, and this has particularly been prominent in the last year with the pandemic and remote and the growth of remote learning, hence why I'm doing this video, because these companies have seen an opportunity to create a new market within the education system. These companies are not providing these services for free. Schools have to buy them. So schools will buy either 365, Apple or Google, and that will form the basis of their internet infrastructure, their technological infrastructure within schools. And these companies will create resources and create programs which will attract schools and educational establishments to them. So things like with Teams, they've developed the Insights app, where we can see who is engaging and when they've engaged and what they've engaged in. With Google Classroom, you can see when people have accessed certain files and things like that. You've got Oak National, which is an online classroom, essentially an online school, where they're providing lessons electronically and remotely from schools. So these global companies are edging their way into how schools are teaching, not just what they're teaching, but how they're teaching. We've also seen an increase in the call for multiculturalism and the decolonisation of the curriculum, with the student body becoming more and more diverse. There is a call for the curriculum to reflect that and to not be ethnocentric. So not just reflecting white British history, but looking at, say, for example, the British colonies and the British Empire, not just from how wonderful, brilliant, we colonised the world and the sun never set on the British Empire kind of view, to a more of a kind of, well, why did we colonise these countries? What impact did our colonisation have on the native and indigenous peoples? Was it such a good thing that we decided that the sun should never set on the British Empire? And also looking, but not all just in terms of what we're teaching, but also how we're teaching, and the people and the sources that we expose students to, making sure that we have a good representation of different ethnicities, genders, sexualities, voices. And that's because this has been influenced by globalization, and you can link it back to that cultural development of culture of globalization, where students are able to access more information. They are exposed to more cultures outside of the education setting, and when they're not seeing that reflected in their education, they see that as exclusionary. and that's not what is wanted for an education. We want to see an inclusive education. So we particularly in the last couple of years, we're seeing this decolonization of curriculum and the move to a more multicultural curriculum. We've also seen an increase in competition between schools and universities for students. So we know that nationally we have league tables, we have Ofsted reports and things like that, which all kind of influence whether or not somebody is sent to a particular school or not. Now, when it comes to, if we're looking at sort of like secondary schools and primary schools and things like that, schools will use multiple different methods to evaluate how good they are as a school, and they may need to attract international students. Now, this is particularly the case with schools such as Wyndham College, which is a boarding school, where although we're a state school, we still need to encourage international students to attend here, and parents are more likely to send their children here if they can see that we are a good school, because there are other international boarding schools available that they could send their children to. Now, this is more prominent when it comes to universities. Universities have to be more competitive for their international students. Now, that's partly because international students bring in more money, their fees are higher, but also if they can promote themselves as an international university, you're more likely to attract students. Okay. And this kind of links in with this idea of global rankings and global education systems. So countries are not, it's not just in schools competing against schools, it's countries competing against countries. And the standard system used to rank education systems is the PISA system. And you've probably heard of the PISA tests. And this is an international assessment program that's organised by the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, and member states and non-member states can use this system to evaluate their education system compared to other education systems in the world. What happens is 15-year-old school pupils are measured on maths, science and reading. Now, not every student takes the test. Schools are invited to take part, and they can say yes, they can say no, it's up to them. And they require a certain number of students to take part to be included in the PISA rankings. So, and what they do is they see whether or not the education system is getting better or not. And what schools do is they then use what the government does, is use this information to kind of go, well, we're not getting better, our education system is not improving, or we're not as good as this other country, and things like that. And what schools, education departments will do, the government departments will do, is look at the high achieving countries, see what they're doing, and see if there's anything that they can then bring into their own education policy to improve the education system of their nation. Now, this sounds like a great idea, because looking at what other people are doing and seeing what's working well for them is great. However, what's often forgotten when they kind of go, well, the Scandinavian countries, which are usually quite high, are doing this thing, and the Singapore and Chinese schools and the Asian schools are doing this thing, and they're high achieving schools. What can we bring to the UK? What's forgotten is that in the UK, we have a different culture regarding education to these other countries. In Asian countries, education is highly valued. it's well funded, it's well resourced, and the general populace view of education is that it is extremely important. And the same in Scandinavian countries, they have very, very high budgets for schools. They have very little in terms of accountability for schools, individual schools and teachers. But again, their culture is one of, we will pay more tax to have a better education system. We trust the professionals to do their job. Whereas in the UK, we have a high accountability system. We have, and this was very prominent in the last 12 months or so, a very negative kind of media presentation of the education system and teachers, with teachers being called lazy and having an extended holiday during the pandemic. And if schools don't open, it's teachers' faults. If schools close, it's teachers' faults. And all of these kind of, anything that schools do, it's wrong. So bringing in those systems from Asian systems and from the Scandinavian systems won't necessarily translate to the culture that we have here in the UK. And finally, globalisation has led to an increase in risk and safeguarding issues for schools. So with technological developments, we now need to think about e-safety and cybersecurity and cyberbullying. We need to think about radicalisation of vulnerable students, in both in terms of religious radicalisation, in terms of the extremist viewpoints such as extreme animal rights or political groups. It's not just about religious groups. We need to think about exposure to inappropriate images and inappropriate content on the internet. And something that was never even considered when I was at school in the 90s was talking about not meeting people you talk to online, because you didn't speak to people online. We didn't have lessons on being safe online. So e-safety and digital citizenship, and that sense of keeping yourself and keeping your students safe, is a very relatively new development caused by those technological developments and those cultural developments that we're seeing on due to globalization. And a good example here is the fact that schools now have to take into account the prevent policy. And you've probably heard that word before. And prevent is anti-radicalization. It's about supporting vulnerable students in their lives to ensure that they're not becoming radicalized, that they're not being used for radical views. And it's a kind of counter-terrorism strategy, but at the same time it is also a safeguarding strategy. And part of the school's role has expanded beyond just keeping you safe while you're in school, but keeping you safe outside of school as well through your online interactions. So, what do various perspectives consider about the impact of globalization on education? I mean, looking at those impacts that we've just looked at, some of those we could say are good things: the decolonization of the curriculum, the increased use of technology in school. They can be positive things, but they can also have a negative impact. For example, the increased risks and safeguarding issues that have become apparent. So the first view that we're going to look at is what's called the hyper globalist view, and this comes from Ome. And Ome argues that globalization has had a positive impact on the education system. It's helped to create students It's helped students to become global citizens, to think outside of the bubble of their school, their town, their nation, and think on a more global scale. He also argues that it's created opportunities for greater respect of different views, religions, general differences that we see around the world. Now, Ome uses the term tolerance as well, and I'm not a big fan of using that in this respect, but I think it has created that greater respect that you can kind of go, that's how you want to live your life, and it's within the law. Great, you do you. I'm going to do me. Rather than saying, you're wrong, I'm right, we're kind of going, okay, I get where you're coming from. You do you, I'll do me, kind of thing. And finally, he argues that globalization has created greater access to information for students, and that has created higher educational achievement. And it's one of the arguments that's brought up every year around exam time, where it's suddenly like, oh, exams are getting easier. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's more a case of students have more access to information, they have more opportunities for study, which means that they're able to achieve higher level grades. Now, does that mean we need exam reform? Probably, but it doesn't mean that exams are getting easier. It just means that you have greater opportunities for study and information gathering. Next, we've got our lovely Marxists, who, as you can imagine, don't think globalization has had a positive impact on education. So our key thinker here is Joel Spring, and he argues that globalization hasn't created greater equality of education. It's actually widened the gap between the privileged and the disprivileged. He argues that technological developments have created a huge digital divide between those who can afford the technologies and those that can't. And this is something that has come up quite a lot recently with remote learning and with the lockdowns during the pandemic, because one of the arguments against closing schools was that not all students would be able to access online learning. There may be families where they have one laptop between 4 children or 2 or 3 children who are all in different year groups, all doing different lessons. People may not have access to the internet, to data, to be able to access the remote learning. And those who don't have that access are then disadvantaged in terms of their educational achievement compared to those who do have that access. He also argues that it means that global corporations are setting the educational agenda. And you can kind of see that with Google and Office 365 and Apple, who are creating these systems for schools for study, that means that they're kind of saying, well, you need to do it this way, or you need to do it that way. And there are, in fact, since the pandemic, there have been people who have tried to cash in by stating stuff like, I'll teach you how to do the best online lessons you possibly can. I will show you how to do this, or do that, or do the other. And fair play to them. We're in a capitalist economy, so make the most of it. But it changes the agenda. It changes what it is that schools are trying to do and trying to achieve. And finally, Joel argues that the globalization has led to the disempowering of teachers. Now, this is something that came up quite recently. It was a tweet that I saw that somebody quoted, where it said that teachers should be arguing for schools to remain open during the pandemic because otherwise they could be out of a job. If students aren't in school, they don't need teachers, they've got Google or they've got the internet. Now, whether or not you agree that with the rise of the internet and the access to information, teachers are becoming redundant or not, that's up to you. But we can kind of see that, particularly from the Marxist view, that globalization isn't creating a better education system, it's creating a more unequal education system. And that unequal education system means that the poor stay poor, the rich stay rich, capitalism ensues, and the current system stays in place. Okay. We then get the neoliberal view, and these state that globalization means that governments can play a reduced role in the education system, and because they're playing a reduced role, and this links into the idea of global transnational companies coming in and taking on education systems, it means that they can reduce funding. Oh, you don't need as much money because you can do it online. So you don't need buildings, you can do it online. That sort of situation, when in fact it could be argued as a counter to the neoliberal view that in fact globalization has meant there needs to be an increase in funding because of the increased risks, the digital divide. The neoliberal view also argues that it's allowing the expansion of private schools and universities to other countries around the world. So, for example, there are universities who have campuses. So they may say, I'm making this up now, but the University of Boston in the United States, for example, may have a campus in Sri Lanka or in Canada. Okay, so although they're affiliate sites, you're still getting your degree from the University of Boston. Harvard University, Cambridge, Oxford, Yale all now offer online courses where you are able to get a degree from those universities without ever having stepped on campus. Okay, and our final view is the new Fordist view, and this view argues that because globalization has created this increasing competition in the job market, and it means that governments need to increase education spending. They believe that globalization has identified more of a need for more need for funding for education so that we can compete on a global scale. As I was saying earlier, they're arguing that we need to be more like the Scandinavian schools in the UK, or we need to be more like the Asian schools. But the new Fordist views are saying, yeah, okay, fine, but you need to match their funding, because otherwise you can't compete on a global scale. Okay, so let's have a look at the exam style question. For this one, we're going to look at a 10 marker with item. So this is one where you will get about 12 minutes to answer. So the key things to remember with this question is that you need to have two clear and distinct points that must be different from each other. If the points are too similar, the examiner could see them as the same one and therefore not give you the marks that you need. Secondly, you must use the item explicitly in your answer. I will be looking for terms such as the item says, the item indicates, the item suggests, all of which will show me that you have taken information from the item. When you're using the item, it must come from two different points. You can't use the same part of the item twice. This shows that you're fully analysing the item. And as ever, don't evaluate, don't include an introduction and conclusion. They're not necessary in this question. You won't get any credit for them. You won't be marked down for including them, but you won't get any credit for including them. So it's best just not to include them at all. So how do we answer this question? So the first thing you need to remember to do with this question is identify your possible points. Ignore the item. If you were just given what are 2 impacts of globalization on the education system, what possible answers could you give? Once you have a range of answers, and you would be looking for trying to get 3 or 4 different answers, then look at the item and look and see where your hooks are. How can you apply the item to the points that you have raised? There's no point looking at the item first. It's not a comprehension exercise. The item is not going to give you the answers. So you need to think about, what are the points I could make? How could the item help me make this point? And then bring it together and explain how this point impacts the education system in the UK. So let's see. When we're looking at possible impacts of globalization on the education system, we could talk about multiculturalism. We could talk about technology, and that could include things like global companies, as well as the digital divide. We could talk about global rankings. Competition, and that can be for jobs or between schools. So we've got quite a few points that we could make. So our next step is then to look at the item and see how we could use the item to link to this. So we're looking at the idea of multiculturalism. Oh, that's not showing up very well. Let's try this one. Yep. So where so has caused changes in politics, culture, and the economics. We've got leading to greater multiculturalism. If we're talking about the digital divide, we can talk about, use this part here, the Marxists only see it as benefiting the wealthy. So we've got 2 points there that we could make. So let's move that on to how we can make that point. So first of all, you can see here that I've used the item straight away. You don't have to do that. You use the item where it fits naturally within the paragraph. It just has to be used. And you can see here, I've very clearly stated I am using the item. So, and I haven't quoted, I've paraphrased. So it flows better within the paragraph. I've then made that into a clear point that answers the question. So globalization has impacted the education system because it's moving away from the ethnocentric curriculum. Now you could use the term decolonization of the curriculum here as well, but either way it's about how schools are becoming more multicultural in their curriculum. And then I've explained why and how this has impacted the national curriculum, talking about how it's often criticised for being very white, British and middle class in nature, and the fact that we are being exposed to different cultures, different ideas, and seeing different ethnicities in the classroom have called for greater multiculturalism within the curriculum. And I've given an example here about how we look at how the authors we study in English and how we approach history, the study of history. And finally, linking back to the question to show the examiner I am answering the question set. Now, 10 markers with items are very straightforward, but it is about you being able to analyse, interpret and infer from the item rather than directly quote or looking for comprehension within the item. So, what to do now? Now that we've gone through the lecture, your task. First of all, I want you to go to the ISB, and as I said, it is Education Part 1, Section E, or you can use the remote learning plans that are available both on Teams or on the website, and use the notes, the check grid, the notes grid, to check your notes, to make sure that you are able to answer all of those questions. And if you've got any gaps in your notes or any gaps in your knowledge, it's an opportunity for you to find them and fill them. If you have any questions, do message me or let me know and I will help you. When you've done that, you've got your consolidation activity and the knowledge questions. Now with the knowledge questions, I want to see two clear colours. I want to see one where you've tried to do the questions without your notes to see what you remember, and then where you've gone back to correct your answers or fill in the answers with your notes. They're not being marked out of 10 or anything like that. You just need to show me that what you know and what you don't know. And the areas that you don't know, they're the areas that you need to go back over and have a look at. And then you have your ESQs. You are only planning your ESQs. So for the 4 and 6 markers, just identifying possible points you could make. For the 10 marker, analysing it, planning it out using the planning sheet and writing the first paragraph. And then for the essay question, you need to write the plan, either the chain of reasoning or the filter sheet, and then your introduction and first paragraph. As I say, any questions, anything you're not sure on, message me, come see me, and I will help you.